The year is 1877. Reconstruction has ended not with justice, but with exhaustion and betrayal. Federal troops withdraw from the South, and the promises made to formerly enslaved black families dissolve into dust. In the humid backroads of the Deep South, power quietly returns to the same hands that once held the whip. Old plantations still stand, their white columns gleaming beneath the sun, hiding rot behind elegance. This is a time when the law bends easily, when silence is safer than truth, and when hatred no longer needs chains to survive. It has learned how to dress well, how to speak softly, and how to call itself tradition. In one such house lives the Brewer family. Their land stretches wide, their name spoken with forced respect by white neighbors and unspoken fear by black ones. On Sundays, they sit in the front pews of church, heads bowed, Bibles open. On weekdays, they sit on courthouse benches, in sheriff's offices, and at the head of town meetings. To the outside world, they are pillars of the community. Inside their home, however, something far darker is carefully taught. Children learn early that God made order, that order requires hierarchy, and that hierarchy must be defended at all costs. Racism here is not shouted, it is inherited, folded neatly into family stories, prayers, and bedtime warnings. Around them, black families attempt to live in the fragile space between freedom and terror. They build churches from scrap wood, teach their children to speak carefully, and learn which roads to avoid after sunset. Every attempt at dignity is watched. Every act of courage is remembered. And when control feels threatened, the night answers. White robes, burning crosses, and whispered plans emerge, not as strangers, but as extensions of men already known. The Brewer family's influence flows seamlessly into the ranks of the Ku Klux Klan, blurring the line between community leadership and organized terror. What more happens in the dark is only the continuation of what was taught at the dinner table. This story does not begin with violence. It begins with belief, with a family that passed hatred down like land, and with a country that allowed it to grow. And while their name will be remembered for cruelty, this story will also remember those who endured them. Because while hate is taught, resistance is remembered. The Brewer legacy begins with Edmund Brewer, a man forged by defeat and humiliation. He returned from the Civil War, not just broken in body, but poisoned in spirit. Where others mourned the loss of a cause, Edmund mourned the loss of dominance. The world he believed God had promised him was slipping away, piece by piece, into the hands of men he had been taught were inferior. He stood on the porch of his plantation at dusk, watching newly freed black families walk past his land with heads held cautiously high, and something inside him hardened. Freedom to Edmund was not a moral reckoning. It was an insult, and insults demanded correction. Inside the Brewer household, Edmund ruled with quiet authority. He did not scream, he instructed. At the dinner table he spoke of order, of natural law, of a God who supposedly favored certain bloodlines. His children listened as he reshaped history into something convenient, something clean. Slavery became necessity, violence became discipline, equality became chaos. His wife nodded along, reinforcing each lesson with scripture taken out of context, turning faith into a weapon polished with righteousness. In this home, hatred did not feel loud or reckless. It felt reasonable. It felt earned. It felt like truth. Outside, the consequences of Edmund's beliefs were already unfolding. A black farmer who refused to sell his land found his barn burned to the ground. A schoolteacher who taught black children to read disappeared on a road that led nowhere. No one ever saw Edmund strike a match or tie a rope, but his presence lingered in every act of terror, like smoke that never quite cleared. Power, he understood, worked best when it didn't need witnesses. By the time his eldest son was old enough to walk the property lines, the lesson was clear. This land was not just soil, it was proof, and anyone who challenged that proof would pay for it in silence. By the early 1880s, Edmund Brewer understood that hatred could not survive on belief alone. Belief needed structure. It needed ritual, secrecy, and the illusion of righteousness. The nights grew heavier as men like him began to gather beyond the reach of lamplight in barns and back rooms where names were spoken softly and faces were memorized in shadow. What began as conversations about protecting the South evolved into oaths sworn over Bibles and whiskey bottles. White robes were folded carefully, not worn in daylight but stored like sacred garments. Terror, Edmund knew, was most effective when it appeared faceless, when fear itself became the messenger. At home, Edmund prepared his sons for this transformation. He taught them that some work could not be done openly, that true power did not announce itself. He spoke of loyalty as something thicker than blood, of silence as a virtue greater than honesty. His eldest boy watched as unfamiliar men came and went through the back door, their voices low, their laughter sharp and hollow. These were not drifters or fools. They were businessmen, lawmen, deacons. The same men who shook hands in public now rehearsed violence in private, convincing themselves they were soldiers in a holy war. Hatred, once whispered at the dinner table, now had uniforms, ranks, and rules. The impact rippled outward quickly. Black families learned to recognize the signs. A sudden quiet before midnight, dogs barking without reason, lanterns moving where no one should be. A cross burned on a hill did not just threaten one household. It warned an entire community. Edmund never needed to attend every gathering. His influence was already sewn into the fabric of the town. When questions arose, they were dismissed. When bodies appeared, explanations followed swiftly. Unknown assailants, tragic accidents. In truth, the message was unmistakable. The Brewer name no longer represented just land ownership. It represented the machinery of fear, now fully assembled and running smoothly in the dark. The Brewer children did not learn hatred in a single moment. It was absorbed slowly, like dampness seeping into wood. By the time Edmund's eldest son, Caleb Brewer, could read, he already understood the unspoken rules of the world around him. He learned which doors were open to him and which were meant to remain closed to others. He learned that black men were to step aside, that black women were to lower their eyes, and that any challenge to this order was not courage but offense. These lessons were never framed as cruelty. They were framed as protection, of family, of heritage, of a way of life that Edmund insisted was under siege. Caleb's education extended far beyond books. He was taken on quiet rides at night, told to stay silent, to watch, to remember. From the shadows, he saw what happened when someone forgot their place. He saw men dragged from their homes, their pleas swallowed by the dark. He saw fire consume wood and faith alike. No one explained these scenes to him directly. They didn't need to. Edmund only ever said one thing afterward: "This is what happens when order is challenged." In that silence, something dangerous took root. Caleb did not recoil. He did not question. He learned that power came from the ability to look away and feel nothing. By the time Caleb reached adulthood, cruelty no longer felt like something done to others. It felt like responsibility. He carried himself with confidence, knowing the town would protect him as long as he upheld its invisible laws. Teachers praised his discipline, pastors admired his devotion, lawmen trusted his word, and beneath it all, the Brewer legacy continued to harden. Hatred was no longer just inherited, it was refined, smoothed of its rough edges, passed forward not as rage, but as entitlement. The most dangerous kind of belief is the one that feels normal. And in Caleb Brewer, the future of that belief was already standing tall. By the turn of the century, the Brewer name no longer needed the cover of darkness to assert itself. Caleb Brewer had learned well from his father. Terror was most effective when backed by legitimacy. He entered public life quietly, not as a brute, but as a man of reason. A deputy at first, then a courthouse regular, then a figure whose opinion carried weight in rooms where laws were shaped before they were ever written down. His smile was calm, his handshake firm. He spoke the language of order fluently, and white men nodded along, grateful that someone like him was willing to keep things stable in uncertain times. With a badge pinned to his chest, Caleb no longer needed to hide his intentions. The same violence once carried out in robes now wore uniforms. Arrests became tools of intimidation. Charges appeared without evidence. Black men who challenged wages, landlines, or voting restrictions found themselves locked behind bars, or worse, released conveniently into the waiting night. Caleb never raised his voice. He simply followed procedure, a word that became a shield against accountability. In his presence, the law felt less like protection and more like a warning. Justice, as he practiced it, had a color and a condition. Inside the Brewer home, the lessons continued. Caleb's children grew up watching their father leave each morning in pressed clothes, a respected man, and return at night carrying the quiet weight of what had been done in his name. They learned early that the badge did not replace the hood. It perfected it. Violence no longer needed spectacle, it needed paperwork. And so the family legacy evolved again, embedding itself deeper into the bones of the system. What Edmund Brewer had started with belief, Caleb secured with authority. The machinery of hate was no longer hidden, it was official. By the 1920s, the Brewer household no longer spoke of hatred as something taught. It was simply assumed. The children of Caleb Brewer grew up believing the world had always looked this way and always should. Their memories were filled with rituals disguised as normalcy. Sunday dinners beneath framed portraits of stern ancestors, stories told with laughter about putting folks back in their place, warnings delivered gently but firmly about who could be trusted and who could not. Racism, by now, had lost its sharp edges inside the home. It had become custom, heritage, something you inherited like silverware or land deeds. The outside world was changing. At least on paper. Newspapers spoke of progress. Northern cities buzzed with new ideas, new freedoms. But in the Brewer town, time moved differently. Segregation was enforced not just by signs and laws, but by memory and fear. Black families knew which sidewalks to avoid, which stores would not serve them, which names carried consequences. The Brewer name was one of those names. It carried weight without effort. No threats were needed. A look, a reminder, a quiet visit from a deputy was enough. Power had become invisible and therefore absolute. Inside the family, this power was celebrated subtly. Children were praised for knowing better. Sons were congratulated for standing their ground. Daughters were taught that purity meant separation, that fear was protection. There were no lectures about hatred anymore because hatred no longer needed defending. It had become the default setting of the world they lived in, and that was the most dangerous evolution of all. When cruelty feels ordinary, it no longer shocks the conscience. It simply repeats itself, generation after generation, unchallenged, unquestioned, and devastatingly efficient. By the late 1930s, the world beyond the Brewer land was shifting in ways the family could no longer fully control. Radios carried unfamiliar voices into southern homes, voices speaking of labor rights, dignity, and distant wars that challenged the idea of white supremacy abroad while leaving it untouched at home. Thomas Brewer, Caleb's eldest son, listened carefully. He wore the family confidence like a tailored coat, but beneath it, something uneasy stirred. For the first time, the old lessons felt strained against a changing reality. Hatred still held power, but it no longer stood uncontested, and that uncertainty made men like Thomas dangerous. Thomas learned to adapt rather than retreat. Where his father relied on open authority, Thomas favored influence. He aligned himself with banks, school boards and zoning committees, places where decisions were made quietly and consequences were slow. Segregation no longer needed mobs. It needed signatures. Black neighborhoods were redlined into decay. Schools were starved of resources. Opportunities disappeared not with a threat, but with a denial letter. The Brewer name evolved again, finding comfort in bureaucracy. Control, once enforced by fear, now arrived dressed as policy. At home, the tension revealed itself in smaller ways. Dinner conversations grew sharper, more defensive. The younger generation asked questions, not out of empathy, but strategy. What if the law changes, one son asked. Thomas answered without hesitation. "Then we make the law work for us." It was not doubt that cracked the inheritance, but adaptation. The brewers were no longer clinging to the past. They were reshaping it, and in doing so, they ensured that their legacy of exclusion would survive even the illusion of progress. By the 1940s, the silence that had protected the brewer legacy for generations began to fracture. It did not shatter all at once. It cracked slowly, through whispered meetings in church basements, through hands clasped in prayer that lingered just a moment longer than fear allowed. Black families who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of the brewer name were growing tired of surviving quietly. War had sent black men overseas to fight for a freedom they did not possess at home, and when they returned, something in them refused to kneel the same way again. The old rules still existed, but belief in them was weakening. Thomas Brewer watched this shift with cold attention. He noticed it in the way black men held eye contact longer, in the way women spoke more boldly to shopkeepers, in the way hymns at church began to sound like declarations instead of pleas. To Thomas, this was not progress, it was provocation, and provocation required response, not with the violence of past generations, which risked exposure, but with pressure. Jobs were lost, loans were denied, school boards suddenly found violations. The brewer machinery moved quietly, efficiently, reminding the town who still controlled the ground beneath their feet. But something had changed that Thomas could not fully extinguish. Fear no longer traveled alone, it walked beside resolve. Each act of retaliation only confirmed what the black community already knew, that their suffering was deliberate, organized, and inherited. And with that understanding came unity. People began to speak names out loud, to remember dates, to document injustices. The brewer legacy had always depended on isolation, on making each victim feel alone. Now, for the first time, the resistance was collective, and collective courage is the one thing inherited power has never known how to silence. By the early 1950s, the struggle that had lived quietly in southern soil began to draw the eyes of the nation. The civil rights movement did not arrive like a storm. It crept in like dawn, slow and undeniable. Organizers came through town in worn suits and quiet conviction, speaking of voting rights, dignity, and a future that did not require permission to exist. Black churches became planning rooms, front porches became meeting halls. For the first time, resistance was not only local, it was connected, documented, and shared beyond county lines. The silence the Brewer family depended on was beginning to betray them. To Thomas Brewer, this attention was the real threat. Violence could be hidden, policy could be buried in paperwork, but witnesses were dangerous. Cameras, reporters, and outside eyes disrupted the careful balance of intimidation. When marches were announced, Thomas leaned on old allies to deny permits, enforce curfews, and provoke arrests. When arrests failed to deter, intimidation returned in quieter forms, threatening letters, midnight phone calls, jobs that vanished overnight. The goal was not merely to stop the movement, but to exhaust it, to remind black families that hope carried a cost their children might pay. Yet the movement did not retreat. Each act of repression hardened resolve. Mothers sent their children to school despite threats. Men stood in line to register to vote, knowing they might lose everything by nightfall. And when violence came, as it always did, it no longer disappeared into rumor. It was photographed, recorded, remembered. The Brewer name, once insulated by local reverence, now appeared in whispers beyond the county, attached to court cases, investigations, and questions they could no longer dismiss. Power had survived in darkness for generations. Under the light, it began to weaken. By the late 1950s, the Brewer name no longer carried the effortless authority it once had. Whispers followed it now, quiet, persistent, impossible to fully silence. Court cases surfaced, not always successful, but public. Journalists began asking questions the family had never needed to answer before. Old incidents were re-examined. Deaths once labeled accidents returned as unresolved mysteries. The past, long buried beneath fear and routine, was being unearthed piece by piece. And with each revelation, the illusion of moral certainty that had protected the Brewers began to to crack. Inside the family, the decay was even more visible. Younger brewers argued, behind closed doors, not about right and wrong, but about strategy and reputation. Some wanted distance from the old methods, afraid of exposure. Others doubled down, clinging to the belief that concession was weakness. Thomas Brewer, now aging and rigid, watched control slip through his fingers. The tools that had once guaranteed obedience, fear, silence, isolation, were failing in a world that was learning to remember out loud. Hatred, when exposed, lost its quiet efficiency. It demanded defense, and defense required explanation. Outside, the black community moved with a steadier confidence. They were no longer asking permission to exist. They were documenting, testifying, and enduring openly. Each act of courage made the Brewer legacy look smaller, meaner, more desperate. Power that depends on denial cannot survive scrutiny. And as the nation's attention turned southward, the Brewer family faced a truth they had never prepared for. History was no longer on their side. The name that once ruled the night now flinched in daylight. By the early 1960s, the damage left by the Brewer legacy was no longer contained within the family walls. It had spread outward, seeping into every street, every institution, every uneasy silence the town had learned to live with. Businesses closed rather than integrate. Schools stagnated under court orders they refused to honor. Violence still flickered at the edges of night, but it no longer carried the certainty it once did. Fear was still present, but now it competed with exhaustion. A community that had spent generations enforcing cruelty was beginning to feel the weight of it, and that weight was unbearable. For the Brewers, consequences arrived not as punishment, but as erosion. Invitations slowed. Allies distanced themselves. Men who once relied on the family's influence began calculating their own survival in a changing nation. Thomas Brewer felt this shift most sharply. He sat in rooms that used to echo with agreement and now hummed with discomfort. The world was moving forward without asking his permission, and for the first time his authority felt fragile. Hatred had promised control. Instead, it had delivered isolation. The lie that had sustained the family, that dominance was destiny, was collapsing under its own rot. Meanwhile, black families continued to endure, not untouched by loss, but no longer invisible. Their suffering, once buried, now stood as testimony. Each march, each courtroom victory, each child walking into a newly integrated school was a quiet indictment of the past. The Brewer legacy, once built on fear, was being replaced by something it could never replicate: moral clarity. And in that contrast, the truth became unavoidable. Power stolen through cruelty never lasts. It only delays the moment when history demands its price. By the mid-1960s, the Brewer name no longer commanded fear, it summoned memory, the kind that refuses to stay buried. Federal laws had changed, court rulings echoed across the South, and the moral ground beneath the family's legacy had fully collapsed. The house that once stood as a monument to power now felt like a relic, heavy with ghosts. Portraits of stern men still lined the walls, but their eyes no longer inspired obedience. They watched in silence as the world they shaped rejected them, piece by piece, without ceremony or apology. The final generation of Brewers inherited something they had not been prepared for: shame. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet weight of knowing that history had named them correctly. Their wealth remained, but influence had thinned. Their words still carried bitterness, but no authority. Attempts to reframe the past as misunderstanding or different times rang hollow against the evidence left behind: records, testimonies, photographs, and living witnesses who remembered exactly who enforced the suffering. The Brewers were not dragged into judgment by a single trial. They were judged by endurance, by the fact that those they tried to erase were still standing. Outside their walls, black communities moved forward with a strength forged in survival. The cost had been unbearable, but the truth had outlived the lie. Children learned names once spoken only in fear and now spoken as warning. Churches rang with songs of freedom instead of survival. And while the Brewer family faded into historical footnotes, The people they oppressed became the living proof that hate, no matter how carefully inherited, cannot outlast collective memory. History did not forgive the Brewers. It remembered them. And that, in the end, was the truest verdict. By the late 1960s, the Brewer family still existed, but their legacy no longer shaped the future. Their name lingered in property records, in yellowed newspapers, in stories told with lowered voices, but it no longer dictated who could live, vote, worship, or dream. The power they once wielded had dissolved into irrelevance, not through repentance, but through exposure. The nation had moved on without their permission. What remained of them was not strength, but residue, the faint outline of a cruelty that failed to sustain itself against time and truth. What endured instead were the people they had tried to crush. Black families whose names never appeared in headlines carried forward something stronger than a dominance. Memory sharpened into wisdom. Parents taught their children not only what had been done to them, but how they survived it. Churches became sanctuaries of history. Stories once whispered became lessons spoken aloud. Resistance no longer needed to shout. It existed in everyday living, in education earned, communities built, and dignity claimed without apology. Survival itself had become the loudest answer to hatred. History does not end with villains redeemed or victims erased. It ends with truth taking its place. The Brewer family built a legacy of exclusion, believing it eternal. But eternity belongs only to what can withstand the light. Their hatred could not. And so it faded, while the descendants of those they oppressed continued forward, living proof that no family, no matter how powerful, can outlive the people who refuse to disappear. This is not a story of forgiveness. It is a story of endurance, and endurance in the end is stronger than hate.